June 2025, for the first time in over 30 years, Canadian importers bought more vehicles from Mexico than from the United States. In a single month, Mexico shipped $784 million in passenger vehicles northward, surpassing American exports by nearly $94 million. The United States had dominated this channel since 1995. That dominance just collapsed. This is not a market fluctuation. This is structural reordering. Subscribe now for strategic analysis on how economic power is shifting across North America. What happens next will reshape your supply chain, your costs, and your access to critical manufacturing corridors. 30 years of integrated production, billions in manufacturing capital, and now, a pivot nobody predicted 6 months ago. The numbers tell the real story behind tariffs, negotiation, and what two nations are doing when the rules change overnight. What Canada just witnessed is the culmination of strategic positioning that began the moment Donald Trump announced his 25% tariff threat on all North American imports in November 2024. The threat was conditional. Control the border, stop fentanyl, secure immigration. It sounded like rhetoric. It became law in January. By April, the tariff was structured and implemented with surgical precision. Every imported vehicle faced a 25% levy unless it qualified under USMCA regulations, meaning at least 75% of its components had to originate within North America. American automakers faced a calculation. They could absorb these costs and shrink margins. They could pass costs to consumers and lose market share to imports, or they could restructure supply chains to lock in cheaper production. General Motors chose the third path. Ford followed. Stellantis made emergency adjustments. What these giants all concluded was identical. Mexico's manufacturing footprint suddenly became the most economically rational anchor point in the entire continental system. Mexico operates 26 heavy automotive assembly plants. Guanajuato alone hosts for General Motors, Toyota, Honda, and Mazda. Aguascalientes runs 3 Nissan facilities. Puebla manufactures Volkswagens and Audis. San Luis Potosi produces BMWs alongside General Motors heavy-duty trucks. Coahuila and Nuevo Leon maintain additional capacity under Stellantis and Kia. These plants maintain installed capacity exceeding 5 million vehicles per year. In 2024, Mexico produced 3.9 million units and exported 3.4 million of them, with 79.7% flowing directly to the United States market. The cost advantage is non-negotiable. Mexican labor compensation remains substantially lower than North American alternatives. Geographic proximity to the U.S. border reduces logistics costs and delivery times. The skilled workforce is trained in lean manufacturing, Six Sigma protocols, and ISO-certified quality systems. Infrastructure integration into the USMCA supply chain ecosystem meant that components could traverse borders multiple times during manufacturing without triggering tariff exposure, provided the final regional content met the 75% threshold. Mexico's automotive parts sector generated $121 billion in 2023, representing a 16.5% year-over-year increase, with 87% destined for U.S. and Canadian markets. More than 300 automotive supplier networks operate across Mexican states. Over 500 Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers cluster around major assembly plants. Canada's position was structurally fragile. General Motors maintains a plant in Oshawa, Ontario, but has steadily shifted production toward U.S. facilities. Ford currently produces nothing at its Ontario location, though it announced future F-Series Super Duty manufacturing there. Honda, Toyota, and Stellantis operate plants in Canada, but utilization rates have declined. Canadian production fell from 2.2 million vehicles in 2017 to approximately 1.9 million units by 2024, a loss of 900,000 vehicles across a 6-year period. Employment in Canadian automotive manufacturing contracted by 1 percentage point relative to the entire North American base between 2017 and 2024, while Mexican employment expanded by 2 points. The tariff structure created an immediate competitive disadvantage. When Trump's April 3 tariff on automobiles took effect, Canada announced retaliatory tariffs of 25% on vehicles imported from the United States. But the tariff applied only to the content value sourced outside of Canada and Mexico. The Canadian government's default assumption set foreign content at 85%, meaning imported vehicles faced an effective tariff rate of roughly 21% after calculation. However, Canada offered tariff offsets for manufacturers that maintained domestic production. General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, Honda, and Toyota, accounting for just under 60% of all Canadian vehicle sales in 2024, became eligible for quota-based relief, conditional on continued domestic production commitment. The offset framework was insufficient. Automakers modeled total cost exposure. They examined production schedules across all North American footprints. When the mathematics resolved, Mexican production offered the lowest friction cost. GM cut a shift at its Oshawa facility and reallocated output to Fort Wayne, Indiana, while maintaining Silao, Guanajuato production at full capacity. Ford announced similar repositioning. Stellantis faced such acute uncertainty that it suspended production at some Mexican and Canadian plants simultaneously, laying off 900 U.S. workers while pausing capital expansion throughout the region. The immediate tactical response was imports. Canadian firms, recognizing the cost penalty, began front-loading shipments from Mexico ahead of deepening tariff scenarios. Data from Statistics Canada recorded the inflection point precisely. In June 2025, Canadian importers brought in $784 million Canadian dollars in passenger vehicles from Mexico, surpassing the $690 million Canadian dollars imported from the United States. It marked the first time in more than 30 years that Mexican-made cars outsold American models in the Canadian market. This was not a temporary spike. Subsequent months reinforced the pattern. The underlying shift was structural, not cyclical. The Canadian government registered the magnitude of this repositioning. Mark Carney's administration recognized that downplaying the Mexico-Canada relationship represented a strategic miscalculation. The Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association of Canada formally warned that Canadian policymakers had underestimated the critical importance of bilateral partnership with Mexico. Flavio Volpe, president of the association, stated explicitly that those who downplayed this partnership fell into the trap set by U.S. President Donald Trump, who sought to separate the two nations. The association emphasized that the automotive industry exemplified the profound integration of all three North American economies. What followed was a doctrinal shift. Rather than attempt to compete with Mexico on labor costs or logistics efficiency, both, Impossible Canada pivoted toward sectoral differentiation. Advanced manufacturing, technology services, specialized resource development, and innovation-driven components became Canadian strategic assets. Canada's highly educated workforce and research capabilities offered comparative advantage in semiconductors, battery management systems, and autonomous driving architectures. But even with this repositioning, immediate trade flow reflected hard economic logic. Mexico was winning on price, proximity, and production capacity utilization. Bilateral Canada-Mexico merchandise trade reached nearly $56 billion in 2024, nearly doubling the $28.7 billion figure from 2023. In the first half of 2025, Canadian imports from Mexico totaled $9.54 billion, while Canadian exports to Mexico stood at only $1.53 billion. The trade ratio reflected Mexico's dominant position as a production hub and Canada's emerging dependence on Mexican inputs. Canada had 82 automotive companies with investments exceeding $608 million in Mexico. Approximately 120 Canadian plants operated within the Mexican automotive and auto parts industrial ecosystem, generating roughly 58,000 direct jobs plus thousands of indirect positions. The realization crystallized in official channels. When Mark Carney's delegation traveled to meet Trump administration officials, the Canadian Trade Minister, international commerce representatives, and foreign affairs officials all participated. The message was recalibrated. Mexico was not an antagonist. Mexico was an essential partner, and the North American production ecosystem could not function without deeper Canada-Mexico cooperation. Alejandra Mayenberg, CEO of Meinberg International Group, articulated the strategic logic. The truth is, we need Mexico to remain as prosperous as it has been. Canadian auto parts manufacturers operating in Mexico have been consolidating for decades, and the commitment to continue investing will not change. This represented a 180-degree pivot from Trump-era rhetoric in 2018, when administration officials attempted to pry apart NAFTA's trilateral framework. The Trump administration's 2024-2025 tariff strategy theoretically aimed to punish Mexico and Canada, reduce the U.S. trade deficit, and encourage manufacturing repatriation to American soil. The opposite occurred. Within months, Mexico's production footprint became more economically attractive, not less. U.S. automakers accelerated nearshoring to Mexico. Canadian firms deepened their exposure to Mexican supply chains. Global manufacturers like Volkswagen, BMW, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and Kia all maintained or expanded Mexican operations, not because of political goodwill, but because the mathematics of production cost, tariff exposure, and logistics efficiency aligned there. The tariff apparatus created precisely what it theoretically opposed: tighter trilateral integration. With Mexico at the production core, Mexico's automotive sector accounted for 17.6% of the country's total manufacturing output and 4% of its gross domestic product. The industry employed more than 1 million people directly, with hundreds of thousands more in supply chain networks. For Mexico, automotive exports exceeded $99 billion annually. For Canada, automotive trade exposure had become inescapable. For the United States, the tariff gambit had accelerated production migration southward while increasing consumer costs through pass-through pricing and component availability constraints. Mexico's production apparatus continued expanding, even as Trump-era tariffs created continental friction. In 2024, total light vehicle production in the region recovered to 16.1 million units, though still below the 2018 peak of 17.4 million. The United States maintained approximately 66% of regional production. Mexico captured roughly 18% and rising. Canada held approximately 12% in contracting. Under USMCA frameworks, vehicles exported from Mexico maintained 90+% compliance with rules of origin, ensuring tariff-free movement to both Canada and the United States for USMCA qualifying goods. The 2026 USMCA review presented existential uncertainty. Analysts warned of stricter rules of origin and heightened scrutiny over Asian content in battery components, semiconductors, and advanced materials. Mexico faced potential challenges meeting more demanding domestic content requirements, particularly in electric vehicle production. The supply chains sourcing critical battery materials, lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, sulfate, and graphite remained dominated by China, which controlled processing capacity for all 5 critical battery metals. China also held 50% of global battery recycling capability. Mexico's EV investments totaled $78.6 million in the first half of 2025, representing a 97.4% collapse compared to 2024 investment levels. The industry paused expansion pending clarity on USMCA regulatory trajectory. Despite this uncertainty, the fundamental restructuring held firm. Canada's intelligence agencies and trade analysts circulated reports quantifying the shift's permanence. Canadian firms recognized that Mexico's proximity, cost structure, and integrated supply chain networks could not be replicated or competed away through tariff manipulation. Trump's April 2025 tariffs on steel and aluminum 25% disrupted supply chains further, but Mexico's manufacturing maintained marginal advantage. Canada faced the choice: attempt competing with Mexico on Mexico's terms, which was economically irrational, or develop complementary capabilities in higher value sectors while accepting Mexican dominance in volume production. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum responded to tariff pressure, not with capitulation, but with institutional reinforcement. The government launched Plan Mexico, a comprehensive economic development initiative targeting 25% GDP investment increases by 2026 and 28% by 2030. Local content targets mandated boosting regional participation in global value chains by 15%, particularly in automotive, aerospace, semiconductors, and pharmaceutical sectors. Incentive programs promoted innovation and dual training in advanced manufacturing. The Mexican federal government publicly committed to maintaining manufacturing competitiveness despite trade uncertainty. For automakers, this institutional commitment mattered. General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, and international manufacturers received clarity. Mexico would remain investment-friendly and cost-competitive. The government would not abandon the sector during trade tensions. Tariffs might fluctuate. Regulatory frameworks might change. But Mexico's fundamental advantages: geography, labor costs, skilled workforce, developed supply chains, government support, and USMCA membership, remained stable. Investment decisions locked in accordingly. New capacity announcements, while moderated by 2025 uncertainty, still favored Mexican locations over alternatives. By mid-2025, production patterns stabilized into their new equilibrium. Mexico supplied 79.7% of its automotive exports to the United States. Canadian imports sourced increasingly from Mexico. The United States maintained the largest absolute production base but surrendered incremental volume gains to southern locations. Global manufacturers operated all 3 countries simultaneously, but Mexican plants became the primary production engines for North American competitiveness against European and Chinese competitors. The strategic reordering exposed something fundamental about modern trade architecture. Tariffs, when applied broadly across integrated supply chains, do not successfully unscramble production networks built over 30 years. Automaker component parts cross the U.S.-Mexico border multiple times during assembly. A vehicle assembled in Mexico contains U.S.-origin steel, electronics, engines, and subsystems. A vehicle assembled in the U.S. contains Mexican-origin components, castings, and subassemblies. The supply chains are neurologically fused. Tony Payan, executive director of the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at Rice University, explained the immutable reality: these are not American vehicles. They're not Mexican vehicles. When you see a plant where a vehicle is being built, what you see is parts coming from many different places. You see a lot of different component parts that are coming in from the United States. They get to the plant, and then they get assembled in Mexico. The Dallas Federal Reserve economists quantified the dependency. From January through November 2024, transportation equipment dominated the trade channel. Roughly $40 billion in transportation exports from the U.S. to Mexico, and $159 billion in transportation imports from Mexico to the United States. The second largest U.S. export category to Mexico was also the number 1 U.S. import category from Mexico: transportation equipment. The U.S. economy depends fundamentally on Mexico and Canada to keep manufacturing costs down and sustain North American automotive competitiveness against the rest of the world. We are not enemies, Federal Reserve economist Jesus Khanna stated. The three countries we complement our production. This complementarity became increasingly visible as 2025 progressed. Canada's reorientation toward Mexico represented mature acceptance of this reality. The historical period when Canada competed directly with Mexico for volume production had ended. Mexico's cost structure had won that competition decisively. Canadian survival required specialization, innovation, and targeted production in higher-margin segments. The tariff crisis accelerated this transition, but it did not create it. Structural forces had been driving this shift for years. Mexico's automotive industry confronted distinct challenges despite its production dominance. Exports fell 13.7% in January 2025 compared to the same month in 2024. Production growth registered only modestly at 1.7% annually. Shipments to the U.S. dropped 10.8%, illustrating vulnerability to market cyclicality and tariff uncertainty. The industry faced pending USMCA review in 2026 with anxiety about stricter content rules. Electric vehicle production remained undercapitalized relative to global EV expansion. Global EV markets reached 17.1 million units in 2024, with China producing 11,064% of total global EV supply, a 40% growth rate. Mexico's EV manufacturing infrastructure remained rudimentary by comparison, yet Mexico's response to these challenges remained disciplined. The government signaled commitment to infrastructure development, industrial parks, and logistics corridors supporting automotive growth. Canada's recognition of Mexico's centrality meant that bilateral cooperation rather than competition could now proceed. Plans for new trade corridors emerged in discussions between Carney's administration and Mexican officials, though detailed frameworks remained in early negotiation stages. By the second half of 2025, the pattern crystallized definitively. Canada imported more vehicles from Mexico than from the United States. Canadian firms deepened supply chain integration with Mexican partners. The bilateral relationship had shifted from unspoken rivalry to explicit strategic partnership. The United States maintained its status as the largest North American producer and the primary end market, but it no longer controlled the production terms unilaterally. Mexico had achieved structural leverage through competitive manufacturing advantage. Canada had accepted its repositioned role, focusing on advanced sectors rather than volume. This reordering reflected mature economic adaptation. The tariff crisis that was supposed to unwind 3 decades of trade integration had instead accelerated it. Companies that attempted to work around Mexico found no viable alternative offering comparable cost, proximity, supply chain maturity, or regulatory certainty. The lesson was simple. Trade architecture built on genuine economic logic cannot be dismantled through tariff leverage alone. The pressure just finds the path of least resistance and consolidates it further. For viewers following North American manufacturing strategy, the signal is unambiguous. Mexico is now the primary manufacturing base for continental competitiveness. Canada is recalibrating toward complementary high-value production. The United States remains the largest market and significant producer, but its ability to dictate production location has diminished. The integration runs deeper than any tariff wall can penetrate. Firms will have to plan accordingly, supply chain managers will have to adapt, and policymakers will have to accept that manufacturing complexity cannot be simplified through unilateral trade restrictions. The question forward is not whether this structure holds it does, but whether it can be optimized for greater efficiency, technological advancement, and shared prosperity across all three economies, or whether continued friction will undermine the region's competitiveness against global manufacturers operating without such internal constraints. The answer will shape North American industrial policy through the next decade.